Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Leah Shade, and I teach preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary. In this presentation, you'll learn how to listen to a sermon and provide constructive feedback. Thank you for saying yes to your pastor's invitation to be part of the sermon feedback group. I'm so glad that you'll be part of creating a generative discussion about the power and effectiveness of good preaching. A sermon feedback group creates a culture of learning, problem solving, and growing in faith within a church. It also contributes to the deepening of relationships with God as we seek to more closely follow Jesus Christ through the leading of the Holy Spirit. In this video, I'm going to give you some tips on how to listen well to a sermon so that you can then provide constructive feedback to the preacher. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that it can sometimes feel uncomfortable to offer feedback to a preacher. You know how much time and effort they put into the sermon. You don't want to hurt their feelings. And you might not feel qualified to offer an evaluation of the preacher. But here's the thing. This is not about evaluation. This is about sharing your response to a sermon in a way that is appreciative and constructive. It's not about tearing anyone down. It's about helping the preacher understand from your perspective how the sermon landed for you. Because when you share this kind of substantive feedback, the preacher can take that and incorporate it into their future sermons. So, for example, perhaps a certain story really resonated for you, but an image that the preacher used did not. Or maybe there was an aspect of the preacher's delivery in their voice or in their body that either enhanced or distracted from what they were saying. Being clear, specific, honest, and forthright, while also being diplomatic and supportive, will provide the preacher with what they need to improve their sermons. This in turn will benefit the whole congregation. By now, your preacher should have given you 2 readings that will assist you in giving sermon feedback. One is Feedback That Works: How to Build and Deliver Your Message by Sloan Weitzel, which has some helpful tips which we'll go over later in this presentation. The other is from the book Novel Preaching: Tips from Top Writers on Crafting Creative Sermons by Alice McKenzie. The chapter you read is called Sermon Shapes: Fiction Writing Strategies for Sermons. The reason for giving you this reading is to give you a behind-the-scenes look at how some homileticians, that a homiletician is a person who teaches preachers, how homileticians instruct students on how to craft their sermons. Once you read this, you'll have language for helping you give specific feedback to your preacher about their sermon. To help you gather your thoughts as you're listening to the sermon and then giving feedback, your preacher should have given you a document called Sermon Talkback Questions. Let's take a moment to read through these together, because this will help you know what to listen and watch for in the sermon. If someone were to ask you what the sermon was about, what would you tell them? In other words, what was the theme or the message of the sermon? What do you remember about how the sermon connected to the theme through the biblical text? What stories, images, characters, or teachings from the scripture passage stood out for you? What grabbed your attention in this sermon? How did the preacher capture your interest in what they were saying? In what ways was their delivery engaging? What did you hear this sermon say about God? in relation to the theme, topic, or biblical text. Continuing with the questions, you're also going to think about, was the sermon easy to follow? Were the transitions clear and logical, or did you get lost at any point? How did you feel listening to the sermon? What emotions came up for you? What did this sermon make you want to do in response to hearing it? In what ways do you feel compelled to put your faith into action after hearing this sermon? Were there aspects of the preacher's voice, hand motions, embodiment, or delivery of the sermon that enhanced or distracted from the message? And finally, is there anything else that you want to say about the sermon or any questions that came up for you? Keep in mind, you're not expected to answer all the questions, but you should put some thought into at least 3 of them so that when you're in the sermon feedback session, you'll have something to contribute. Now, let's talk about how to give sermon feedback well. As Sloan Weitzel says in his book, Feedback That Works, effective feedback should enable the receiver to walk away understanding exactly what he or she did and what impact it had on you. When the result is this specific and direct, there's a better chance that the person getting the feedback will be motivated to begin, continue, or stop behaviors that affect performance. That's our goal for you and your sermon feedback group, that you'll give and the preacher will receive the kind of feedback that will help them understand exactly what they said or did in a sermon that had an impact on you as a listener. Having that kind of specific feedback can inspire the preacher to improve their sermons for the whole congregation. By now, you should have had a chance to read through the pages from Feedback That Works. Weitzel provides a list of 10 mistakes to avoid when giving feedback. I won't read through all of the explanations, but I do want to briefly go over what we want to avoid when giving sermon feedback. We want to avoid feedback that judges the person, not their actions. We want to make sure that this is not saying that the person is somehow lacking in something, but just something that happened or was done in the sermon needs to be improved. We don't want feedback that is too vague. Remember, we want specificity. We don't want feedback that speaks for others instead of for yourself. Like, I heard other people say this about the sermon. We're not interested in that. We're interested in what you say about the sermon. We don't want negative feedback that gets sandwiched between positive messages. But I have a little caveat to that, which I'm going to say more on in a few minutes. We also don't want feedback that is exaggerated with generalities. Again, we want things to be specific. We want to avoid feedback that psychoanalyzes the motives behind the behavior. So you don't want to say something like, maybe it's because your dog died that this is the way you preach the sermon, and that's what the problem was. You don't know what's going on in the preacher's head. You want to just talk about the topic in the sermon and what happened in the sermon rather than the thought process that went into it. We also want to avoid feedback that goes on too long. So when you're in the feedback group, you want to be concise, specific, and allow other people to share their feedback as well. Sloan also says that we should avoid feedback that contains an implied threat. I don't think that's going to be an issue with this group, but I'm just including it because he has it in there. We also don't want to have feedback that uses inappropriate humor, which again, I don't think will be a problem in this group. And then finally, feedback that is actually a question, not a statement. So couching it that way can actually not be as helpful. So just be direct. Now, I want to say for this last one that it is okay to ask a question of the preacher in the feedback sessions. That's okay to do. Like if there was a term that you didn't understand, or if there was a place where the transitions weren't clear from one section to the next, you can certainly ask questions to help you understand what the preacher intended. Now let's talk about what will happen in a sermon feedback session. You want to gather in a circle or around a table so that it feels like a group discussion rather than an interview. The facilitator of the group will call everyone together and begin with prayer. Then the preacher is given an opportunity to say what kind of feedback they are specifically looking for about the sermon. Maybe they're wondering if their explanation of a biblical text was clear, or if a certain image that they used resonated with people. Or maybe they experimented with a different form or style of preaching and would like to hear responses about that. Whatever it is, you'll want to keep that in mind so that this aspect of the sermon is addressed sometime during the session. Then the facilitator will ask each person to share one thing they really appreciated about the sermon or what resonated for them. We always start with the positive feedback because it can be tempting to skip over the strongest parts of the sermon and only focus on what needs to be improved. As you're giving feedback, this is where you can draw on your notes from the sermon talkback form. Also, be sure to share just one thing, because if you give your whole list, there might not be anything for others to contribute. Now, when you're giving positive feedback, you want to say something more substantive than, I liked your story about Timmy. You want to be more specific. What did you like about it? Why did it resonate for you? As you read the section on developing effective feedback skills, you can use the feedback technique called situation, behavior, impact. In other words, you'll start by describing the part that really affected you. And then you're going to say why it was impactful for you. For example, if your preacher delivered a sermon about the prodigal son, you wouldn't just say, I like the way you talked about God in this sermon. Instead, you might say, when you described God as a heartsick father and the son as a homesick child, that helped me understand God in a way that I could relate to because, and then you would go on from there. As another example, if your preacher delivered a sermon about Queen Vashti in the book of Esther, you wouldn't just say, I learned a lot about Vashti. That's too general, too unspecific. Instead, you could say, I didn't realize that Vashti was actually resisting the patriarchy when she stood up for herself. That helped me see her in a whole new light. And you would go on from there. After each person has had a chance to share their thoughts, then the preacher has a chance to respond if the preacher hasn't already responded to the feedback along the way. Then the facilitator will move the group into a period of constructive critique. So this is where you'll share if there were things that were unclear or confusing or inconsistent about the sermon. Were there growing edges that you think the preacher could work on? Is there something that could have been improved in either the biblical description or in applying it to people's everyday lives? What could have been improved? Again, you'll share just one thing so that everyone has a chance to contribute. And you'll want to continue using the situation, behavior, impact technique. So instead of saying something like, well, the sermon was kind of boring, you could say, I was looking for an emotional hook with the sermon and just had difficulty relating to it. Or instead of saying, you wave your hands and arms around too much or too little, you could say, I'm a visual learner. So I appreciate when you use your hands to emphasize certain points. For example, when you talked about Queen Vashti's defiance, maybe you could put your hand up to show her saying, stop. Again, once everyone has had a chance to share one piece of constructive feedback, the preacher can then respond, or the preacher can be responding along the way if needed. Using your time well in this 60-minute session is important. The orientation and the two parts of the sermon feedback session should be concentrating on positive feedback and constructive critique. And that should take about 45 minutes. Then you'll spend the last 15 minutes with any other questions or issues that hadn't yet come up. Here you want to circle back to make sure that the aspect of the sermon that the preacher wanted feedback on was addressed. As you're closing out, it's fine to reiterate the strengths of the sermon. So in this case, what Weitzel talks about in the 10 common mistakes about sandwiching negative feedback between two positives doesn't really apply. It is fine to end on a positive note. Finally, the facilitator will close with prayer and the session will be complete. Be sure to share the notes from your sermon talkback form with the preacher so that they can have them to refer back to when thinking about future sermons. And if you have further thoughts about the sermon after the session, you can either share that with the preacher on your own or wait until the next sermon feedback session. I hope this video has been helpful for you as you're planning your first sermon feedback session. I want to encourage you to see this group as an opportunity to deepen your relationship with God and God's people, as well as help your preacher improve their sermons with this particular congregation at this particular time. May God bless your sermon feedback sessions.